Thank you to the Coalition for having us talk today about immigration laws and new marijuana legislation. My name is Kelly White. I'm with the Capital Area Immigrants' Rights Coalition located in Baltimore, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. I'm here with my co-presenter and interpreter.
Buenos días, estamos aquí con Rebecca Spira y Kelly White. Estamos aquí por la Coalición de Legalización de Marihuana y de los Inmigrantes. Mi nombre es Frank Martínez y yo soy el intérprete.
Good evening. My name is Rebecca Spira, and I'm a staff attorney with CARE Coalition's Fairfax County Universal Representation Program. This means that I represent individual residents of Fairfax County who are fighting deportation.
Okay. Es un staff attorney y ella está representando aquí a la gente en la justicia.
And just want to thank Frank, our interpreter, who's making sure that this presentation is accessible to everybody.
Y quiero agradecer a Frank porque él está asegurando que esta presentación está siendo traducida.
And next slide. So who we are is a group of attorneys and advocates who serve hundreds of people on any given day who are detained in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, as well as some people who are detained by ICE and transferred out of state. We serve 4 detention centers.
Somos un grupo de personas que representan a la gente que es detenida en 4 diferentes lugares en detention centers.
And these are 4 detention centers where people are detained: Dorchester County, Maryland, Worcester County in Maryland, ICA Farmville in Virginia, and Caroline Detention Center in Virginia.
Y esos son los cuatro centros de detención en Virginia y en Maryland.
And we serve both adults and children who are detained and at risk of detention.
Servimos a niños y adultos que están que tienen problemas de ser detenidos.
We go into detention centers and provide Know Your Rights presentations. We intake people who are about to go before an immigration judge in removal proceedings.
Ellos van al centro de detención y aseguran que la gente sabe sus derechos y sí.
And we are able to represent people who are residents of Prince George's County, Baltimore City, District of Columbia, and of course, Fairfax County.
Ellos representan los grupos que representan a Fairfax County. What other counties did you say?
Baltimore City, District of Columbia, and Fairfax.
Okay. Esos son los counties que ellos representan.
And we also have funding to represent people who have severe post-traumatic stress disorder and other mental health related concerns.
Y ellos también ayudan a la gente que tiene problemas mentales y estrés.
This does not cover everyone, though, as there's still thousands of people every year who are detained without representation. And so in those cases, we try to mentor and support pro bono attorneys to represent those people.
Eso no representa a todas las personas porque hay muchas personas que son detenidas, pero ellos también ayudan a los pro bono attorneys a poder representar a esta gente.
We primarily focus on representation of people, class actions, litigation, and we also try to push to change the law through both litigation and statewide legislation.
Ellos también ayudan con la litigación de la clase, también con la legislación de educación. Y, sí.
And ultimately, we hope to push for the right to court-appointed counsel in immigration proceedings.
Okay. Ellos quieren ayudar a poder tener un sector público en que la gente se pueda defender.
And just to see who's detained by ICE, if you could click forward, please. There's some bullet points that come up. So people who are recently arrived, people arrested at the border, people arriving seeking asylum, they are immediately detained. If you come to this country and say, hey, I'm here to seek asylum, the US government reacts by immediately detaining people. Immigrants in the interior of the United States, including people who are undocumented, people who have criminal convictions, who have already served their sentence, and undocumented folks, as well as people who already have green cards.
Aquí dice quién es detenido by ICE, la gente que recién llega a los Estados Unidos, la gente que es aprendida por la policía, la frontera, la gente que llega aquí buscando asilo, los inmigrantes en el interior de los Estados Unidos, la gente indocumentada con récords criminales y que ya han servido su sentencia. También gente indocumentada que no tienen ningún récord criminal, pero tienen raíces en los Estados Unidos. También gente que ha venido a los Estados Unidos que tiene una green card, pero no tiene ningún récord criminal.
And today, before we begin our discussion about how marijuana offenses or the change to marijuana laws affect immigrants, I first want to share with you a video we have of a man named Eder who was impacted by marijuana conviction. And so now we're going to transition to a video.
Antes de que empecemos el video, antes de que empecemos la charla por la marihuana, vamos a ver un video de Eder que tuvo un problema con marihuana en los Estados Unidos.
I did 25 hours of community service and 1 year of
probation
Yeah.
for not actually possessing any marijuana.
Correct.
And then you got detained for that possession
Correct.
where you hadn't possessed any marijuana.
Correct.
Okay.
I didn't have any marijuana on, but I had a grinder on, and one of my taillights was busted on my car. So, sheriff pulled me over, and they were like, "Do you have any weapons, drugs, anything like that on you?" And I told them, "Well, yeah, I got a grinder on." I didn't lie to them. I told them what I had. They opened it up. They didn't find anything, but they found, the little residue around the rim, and they're like, "Well, your possession." They had me waiting for about almost 3 or 4 hours before they actually got to me and actually told me what the situation was. They told me that they were going to take away my green card and they took away my passport, telling me that investigate me for the previous charge that I had. The second time that I came around, then they told me that it was for possession that I had. One of the Homeland Securities told me to prepare myself, that I was going to be detained the next time I came around.
Immigration detention is the practice of holding immigrants while they await a determination of their immigration status, or they may also potentially be waiting deportation. Detention and deportation can tear apart families and destabilize our economy. Since 2009, Congress has mandated the Department of Homeland Security's Immigration and Customs Enforcement keep at least 34,000 detention beds operational. The current administration has been pushing for an expansion of funding to increase the number of beds required by the detention bed quota.
But we're taking people out of the country. You wouldn't believe how bad these people are. These aren't people. These are animals. And we're taking them out of the country at a rate that's never happened before.
In detention, immigrants are subject to very harsh conditions, including inadequate medical care, and they also don't have access to counsel. Only 37% of all immigrants and a mere 14% of detained immigrants secure representation. After meeting Adar, Care Coalition staff realized he might be able to keep his green card and avoid being deported, and we were able to match him with a pro bono attorney who assisted him in his application for cancellation of removal, a remedy available to green card holders with very limited criminal history.
First time I met with the judge, it was through a video. It was quick. I mean, no information was given. All they did was read my name, what I was detained for, and they're like, "Well, here's the next date. We'll see you then." It wasn't like, "Oh, it's gonna be next week," or it was like, "Okay, we'll see you in 3 months." So in total, it was 6 months that I was there. But every single time I went in, it was real quick. "You got a lawyer?" "Yes." "No." "Okay, well, here's your next date." There was a guy there. He was there for 3 years. Also, being in the actual detention center, I suffer from chronic gout. I actually got one of those attacks while I was in the detention center. Literally, I couldn't get off of bed. It took them almost a day and a half for them to actually come and finally wheel me into the nursery. And even then, when the doctor was checking in, he was like, "Oh, did you go outside and hurt yourself?" I was like, "No, I suffered from this." He's like, "Oh, okay. That sounds like a very good story." So basically, they treat me like a liar, you know? It's crazy how they treat you like a hardcore criminal in there, you know? There was a detainee on the other side, and basically everybody that was on the other side was calling the CO like, "Hey, this guy's having an attack." And the CO just ignored it. It wasn't until the guy was on the floor basically choking on his own spit that he actually was like, "Oh, code red. And all these COs start rushing in. I mean, you literally gotta be to the point of almost dying or you know, some really bad situation that they actually gotta give you a hand.
Since 2003, over 180 people have died in immigration detention. When an individual is detained, their entire family feels the consequences. In Adar's case, he missed the birth of his first child while he was in detention for 6 months. And that's an experience that he's never going to be able to get back.
I cried the whole time we were at the airport, and I cried the whole time on the way home from the airport, and I probably cried the whole 6 months off and on that he was there, because I never thought that I would do the whole parenting thing by myself. So that was already new for me, and I never thought I'd have to go into the NICU and see Tommy and make all those medical decisions without Adar being there. Donald Trump, what I feel like, is super against a lot of immigrants, and it kind of makes me sad a lot, because not all immigrants are bad people or bad for this country. I know we got into a situation I never thought would happen, so I fear maybe something like that could happen again.
You want a safe life for you and your family.
Yeah, of course, you know, I mean, it's definitely not a safe place out there right now, at least right now.
I already had so much.
So that was Edar, and he shared the story of he went on a church missions trip to El Salvador, and prior to that he had a marijuana conviction, and he came back into the country and was detained, and was unable to get released from detention, because somebody who leaves, even if they have a green card, and comes back and has a single offense of marijuana, is considered to be mandatorily detained. And during that time, he missed the birth of his first child.
Esa fue la historia de Edar. Él fue a una misión de su iglesia a El Salvador, y antes de que fuera a El Salvador, él tenía una convicción de marihuana, y cuando él regresó a los Estados Unidos, fue detenido, y durante ese proceso él perdió el nacimiento de su primer hijo.
Now I'm going to hand it over to Becca.
Thanks, Kelly. So, as Kelly mentioned, CARE Coalition helps immigrants in immigration detention, which are essentially jails. When I meet my clients, they are in a detention center, usually in one of the 2 detention centers in Virginia.
Como Kelly mencionó, CARE Coalition ayuda a los inmigrantes y a los detenidos, y ellos ayudan a la gente que está en 2 centros de detención.
And these detention centers are usually either Farmville Detention Center, which is about 4 hours outside of DC, or Caroline County Detention Center in Bowling Green, Virginia, about an hour and a half south of DC.
Esos centros de detención están either en Farmville, que no están muy lejos, y hay otro también en DC que está como 1 hora y media de donde están ellos.
Great. And all of my clients are facing deportation.
Y todos los clientes están al punto de ser deportados.
So I'd like to contextualize this conversation by highlighting first a few things you might not know about deportation proceedings.
Ella le gustaría representar algunos puntos que no están representados en los casos de inmigrantes.
So first thing that you might not know is that unlike criminal court, where if somebody cannot afford an attorney, the criminal court will appoint a public defender. In immigration court, there is no right to court-appointed defense attorney.
Con la diferencia de de una convicción criminal, los inmigrantes no tienen representación con un defendant.
So this means that if you are in immigration proceedings and you cannot afford an attorney, you will essentially have to represent yourself if you want to fight your case.
So esto significa que si usted no tiene dinero para poder tener a alguien que lo represente, entonces usted tiene que representarse usted mismo.
So this is pretty unbelievable, given that the alternative would be just accepting deportation, which is oftentimes to a place that people have fled for reasons like they might fear death in their home country, or they might want to be with their family that's here in the United States.
Y esto es difícil de creer porque alguna gente, la otra alternativa que tienen es de ser deportados, y en casos que ellos están saliendo de su país porque hay gente que los quiere matar o porque ellos quieren estar aquí con su familia en los Estados Unidos.
And another thing you might not know about deportation proceedings is that the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is also known as ICE, has the authority to detain those who they suspect to have violated our immigration laws.
Y otra cosa que tal vez no saben es que ICE también puede tener alguna persona que no tenga. What was the last name again?
ICE has authority to detain people that they suspect violated immigration laws.
ICE tiene el poder de detener alguna persona que ellos crean que haya hecho algo para infringir la ley.
So one question is, how does ICE find people to arrest? Now, there are many ways that people end up in detention, but most of my clients end up in immigration detention because of some kind of contact with law enforcement or local police, such as a speeding ticket, a busted taillight, or a traffic stop.
So la pregunta es cómo ICE encuentra a la persona para detenerlos. Y la respuesta es de que ICE usa la policía para poder detener a la gente que tenga un ticket, una violación, como tener una luz quebrada en su carro o cosas así.
And you can imagine it's unbelievably easy for a police officer to run prints, connect these with ICE, and sort of flag for ICE that somebody might be undocumented. And you can see how this creates somewhat of a pipeline from local law enforcement to ICE.
So, entonces, la policía lo hace bien fácil para ICE de poder identificar a estos individuos que les dan el récord criminal y les dan todo lo que ellos necesitan saber. Y sí, entonces hacen una conexión con ICE y ellos trabajan juntos.
Okay, and then the third thing that you might not know is that while some people who end up in immigration detention will be given an option to pay a bond and leave immigration jail, some people do not have that option because certain criminal convictions subject them to what's known as mandatory detention.
Y otra cosa que tal vez no saben es que ellos también tienen el derecho de pagar un bond que les da el derecho de poder salir la detención, pero en algunos casos ellos no tienen el derecho por una detención mandatoria.
So what is mandatory detention? The Immigration and Nationality Act at Section 236C, subsection 1, has a provision known as the mandatory detention provision, under which non-citizens with certain criminal convictions are not entitled to a bond hearing and must remain in detention while deportation proceedings are pending against them.
Entonces, la detención mandatoria es la gente que está en la detención mandatoria que no tienen derecho a un bond. Y ellos tienen que permanecer en la detención mandatoria mientras el proceso está contra ellos.
So a person who is subject to mandatory detention has two options, essentially. They can either stay in jail and fight their case without the right to court-appointed counsel, or they can be deported.
So, las personas en detención mandatoria tienen dos opciones. Ellos pueden permanecer en la cárcel y luchar por su detención, o ellos pueden ser deportados.
Now, what does all of this have to do with marijuana, which is what brings us to this conference today? As I said, under the mandatory detention provision, those with certain criminal convictions cannot ask for release on bond.
Entonces la pregunta es, ¿qué es lo que tiene que hacer esto con marihuana? Y entonces la detención mandatoria dice que esas personas no pueden ser liberadas en un bond.
And among those convictions are convictions related to a controlled substance.
Y entre esas convicciones están las personas detenidas por una sustancia.
So you might be thinking, well, now in Virginia, marijuana isn't illegal anymore, so there shouldn't be a problem. Well, think again. Because immigration law is federal, the federal definition of controlled substance is what the provision in the Immigration and Nationality Act refers to. And so this is what the judge will look to when determining whether someone can even ask for bond. And the Immigration and Nationality Act 236C1 says that anybody who has that essentially a person is subject to mandatory detention if they have been convicted of a controlled substance violation. And unfortunately, as I said, this refers to the Controlled Substances Act. And unfortunately, marijuana is on the list of federally controlled substances in the Controlled Substances Act. It's a Schedule I drug. So if you go to something like DEA.gov, they will have a whole list of all of the drugs that are on the controlled substances list. And right there, I've circled it, marijuana is still on that list. So, leave time for interpretation.
Entonces la pregunta es, ¿por qué la marihuana es un problema si no es ilegal en Maryland? Entonces,
Virginia.
En Virginia. Pero la marihuana está sobre la categoría de sustancias sobre el Federal Act. Entonces, si ustedes van a un website de DEA.com, entonces ustedes miran que la marihuana todavía está en esa lista, como pueden ver en el círculo.
A person who has been convicted of a marijuana-related offense has been convicted of a crime relating to a controlled substance and is therefore subject to mandatory detention and possibly other grounds of removability or bars to relief.
Si hay una persona que ha sido detenida por marihuana, entonces ellos han sido tratados sobre el control substances y ellos tienen que ser detenidos mandatoriamente.
Great. So all of that was pretty abstract and jargony. Oopsie, sorry. I'm going to go back 2 slides. There we are. Pretty abstract and jargony, but I want to illustrate what this looks like in practice by telling you all about a client of mine named Jamie, who was charged with possession of marijuana, simple possession, in April 2020 in Fairfax County.
Entonces ella les quiere dar un ejemplo de cómo esto se puede ver en la vida real de una amiga de ella en Fairfax County en el año 2020.
And so Jamie was a client of mine. And when he was about 16, he was in El Salvador playing soccer with some friends when police officers came looking for somebody who they thought was a suspected gang member. They held up a photo of a person that Jamie had never seen before, and he told this to the police officers.
Jamie es un cliente de ella y tenía 16 años cuando ella estaba en El Salvador y la policía vino cuando él estaba jugando un juego de pelota y le enseñaron una foto del criminal y le preguntaron si sabía quién era.
So the officers took Jamie and his friends into the woods, threw them to their stomachs at gunpoint, and beat them up. After which Jamie fled to the U.S., fearing that he'd be killed by police or gangs.
Entonces la policía tomó a Jamie y sus amigos, lo llevaron a la selva y los golpearon y Jamie pudo escapar y entonces él vino a los Estados Unidos con miedo de que él podría ser matado o herido.
So when Jamie was 20 years old, he and his friends shared a small amount of marijuana.
So cuando Jamie tenía 20 años, él y sus amigos compartieron un poquito de marihuana.
Fairfax County police arrested him and charged him with simple possession.
Entonces la policía de Fairfax County los arrestó y los acusaron de tener una pequeña posesión de marihuana.
As Jamie was leaving the police station, ICE picked him up and brought him to the Caroline County Detention Center in Bowling Green, Virginia.
Entonces, cuando Jamie estaba saliendo la estación de la policía, ICE entonces lo detenió y lo llevaron a un centro de detención.
So, because Jamie was in immigration jail, he was unable to appear before the criminal court on the marijuana charges, marijuana charges. It's not as if when a person is transferred to ICE custody, ICE is so nice as to let them leave to go appear for the criminal proceedings.
Entonces, cuando Jamie tenía su cita para luchar por su detención, él no pudo ir porque ICE no le permitió a él salir de la detención.
So, because Jamie missed his criminal court date because he was in ICE custody, he was found guilty in his absence in the Fairfax General District Court, which is called an in absentia conviction.
Entonces, porque Jamie no pudo ir a su cita porque él estaba detenido by ICE, entonces él fue encontrado culpable porque no pudo atender de su sentencia.
So Jamie now had a conviction for possession of marijuana and had triggered the mandatory detention provision and could not even ask the immigration judge for a bond.
Entonces, nada, Jamie fue culpable de esta convicción, entonces él no pudo no pudo tener el bond para su convicción.
So Jamie now had two choices. He could either fight his case or accept deportation.
So now Jamie tenía dos opciones que serían de luchar por su caso o ser deportado.
Jamie decided to fight his case. I had the opportunity to represent him and help connect him with a wonderful public defender out of Fairfax County who helped him get his case dismissed. And by case, I mean his marijuana case.
Entonces, Jamie decidió luchar por su caso y eso es cuando Rebecca lo ayudó a poder defender su caso y él tuvo su caso de marihuana dismissed o ya no lo tiene.
Now, I want to emphasize that he was able to get out on bond, but only because he got rid of the conviction.
Y él pudo salir de su caso por bond, pero eso fue solo porque él tuvo su caso dismissed.
Now, this was a really good outcome for Jamie, but I want you all to think that if Jamie were a US citizen, all he might have had to do when he was at the police station after he had been charged with possession of marijuana is maybe come back and pay a fine, or at least have the opportunity to get a lawyer at that time. But because Jamie was undocumented, he was shuttled into this jail to deportation pipeline with near devastating consequences.
Esto fue un buen resultado para Jamie, pero si él hubiera sido un ciudadano de los Estados Unidos, todo lo que él habría tenido que hacer es, después de salir de la estación de la policía, fue haber pagado una multa o poder tenido un abogado.
So today, what's wonderful is that the law has changed. The statute under which Jamie had been charged, Virginia Code 18.2-250.1, which covered adult simple possession, has now been repealed.
Yeah. Entonces la ley que Jamie había sido culpable, ahora ya no existe.
Parts of the Virginia Code still cover possession of marijuana with intent to distribute and distribution of marijuana at the misdemeanor felony levels, depending on the quantity. But the remainder of the new marijuana laws are spread throughout the administrative code under section 4.1.
Entonces la ley de Virginia todavía encuentra a la gente culpable si ellos tienen intenciones de distribuirla o si ellos quieren distribuirla.
But the remainder of the new marijuana laws are spread throughout the administrative code under section 4.1.
El resto de las leyes de marihuana están sobre las leyes de 4.1.
Great. So just to briefly go over what is legal, possession by adults 21 years and up to an ounce in public.
Entonces, lo que vamos a hacer es ir sobre las cosas que todavía están legales. Y una de ellas es la posesión de adultos de 21 años o más por una onza de marihuana en público.
Personal cultivation of up to 4 plants.
La cultivación personal de 4 plantas.
Adult sharing of up to 1 ounce in private without remuneration.
Adultos compartiendo 1 onza en privado.
And participating in medical marijuana.
Y participando en marihuana medicinal.
And I want to touch on how this change, this great legal change, could benefit immigrants.
Y ella quiere hablar de cómo este cambio puede beneficiar a los inmigrantes.
So this does have in many ways wonderful implications. If it's not possible to obtain a conviction for simple possession of marijuana by an adult, then it shouldn't be possible for that same activity to trigger immigration consequences.
Siendo posible que no es posible de que un adulto pueda tener una implicación por una implicación simple de marihuana, no debería ser posible de que esto también puede tener consecuencias al nivel de los inmigrantes.
And it limits the likelihood of police interaction that could put someone in deportation proceedings.
Y también limita wasn't the police?
It limits the likelihood of encounters with the police that could put somebody in the deportation pipeline.
Y también limita la posibilidad de que la policía ponga a alguien en las detenciones de inmigrantes.
However, I do want to note that police can still stop and search an individual based on marijuana, and that can lead to immigration consequences later.
También quiero hacer el punto de que la policía todavía puede detener a alguien y los pueden buscar por posesión de marihuana, y también eso los puede llevar a ser detenidos por casos de inmigrantes.
But I want to also turn our attention to what is not legal. So, as I said before, the statute under which Jamie had been convicted was repealed, but there are new marijuana laws that are spread throughout the administrative code.
Entonces ella quiere ir sobre lo que no es legal, y lo que Jamie había sido detenido ha cambiado, pero también hay algunas cosas que siguen igual.
So some of these things are public consumption.
Alguna de estas cosas es la estar consumiendo la marihuana en público.
Possession or consumption by anyone under 21.
La posesión o el consumo de marihuana por cualquiera sobre la posesión o el consumo de marihuana de alguien que sea menor de 21 años.
Having an open container in a vehicle.
Tener un contenedor abierto en un carro con marihuana.
And sharing or offering in public.
Y también compartiendo o ofreciendo en público.
So all of these things are still illegal, and they're spread throughout the administrative code. And as an immigration attorney, what concerns me is whether these violations will still trigger immigration consequences.
Entonces, todas estas cosas todavía están en el código administrativo, y lo que le preocupa a ella es que estas cosas puedan afectar a alguien que sea un inmigrante.
So depending on the offense, while some of the illegal activities outlined in the code are civil infractions, while others, particularly on the third offense, are actual criminal misdemeanors and felonies. Or I believe just criminal misdemeanors.
Dependiendo de la infracción, todos estos están sobre, dependiendo de la infracción, esos son faltas de ciudadanos, pero en la tercera infracción, entonces esto se convierte en una falta criminal.
Okay, so to go back to the question whether these are going to trigger immigration consequences, well, the first question we have to ask is, do they relate to a controlled substance? The answer is yes. We know that marijuana is still a controlled substance under the Controlled Substance Act. But the next question, and critical for immigration purposes, are these criminal convictions under the Immigration and Nationality Act? The answer is yes and no, or it depends. It's clear that on the third offense, many of these offenses will be charged as misdemeanors, but there's sort of which clearly would be a criminal offense. But it is an open question about the first or second offense. These are civil infractions, and so there are arguments that despite not being named criminal in nature, an immigration judge still could find them to be convictions for immigration purposes. So for all intents and purposes, they could trigger mandatory detention. So as an immigration attorney, what I'm asking myself is somebody like Jamie, a 20-year-old undocumented individual who is sharing a little bit of marijuana with friends, perhaps in a park, safe to share in the benefits of the decriminalization or the legalization of marijuana? And looking at some of these violations, well, okay, possession or consumption by anyone under 21, that would mean my client, Jamie. Public consumption, sharing or offering in public, Those would all probably mean my client. So the answer is he's probably not benefiting from this change in law. So to answer my own question, the answer is he's probably not benefiting. So to date, while this change is in many ways really beneficial for a lot of citizens, and a lot of individuals who might be brought into the pipeline had they otherwise been charged with
The interpret.
Oh, I'm so sorry, the interpreter. Sorry, Frank.
You might have to repeat some.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Do you want to just start and then I can pick up where you leave off?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Entonces lo que se pregunta ella es que si Jamie, una persona de menor de 20 años, si él se puede beneficiar de este cambio de ley, en que si compartiendo marihuana con alguien lo va a poner a riesgo de su caso de inmigración.
Because we know that possession or consumption by anyone under 21 is not legal. And we also know that sharing or offering in public is not legal.
Porque sabemos que la posesión y el consumo de cualquiera que sea menor de 21 años no es legal, y también compartiendo o ofreciendo en público.
So the answer is somebody like Jamie is probably not still able to share in the benefits of legalization because there's a risk that even a civil violation could trigger immigration consequences like mandatory detention.
So, entonces la respuesta es de que una persona como Jamie no podrá tener los beneficios de la legalización de la marihuana porque hay cosas como esas infracciones que puedan causar consecuencias de inmigración.
So to date, while this change is in many ways beneficial, in Virginia, immigration consequences do remain.
Entonces, como el cambio de ley de la legalización de marihuana puede ser beneficiario, entonces algunas cosas todavía quedan en lugar.
And then just one final note I'll make is that as a practical matter, what it really comes down to, and much of this comes down to, is local policies of non-prosecution to make sure that people like Jamie are not being targeted by law enforcement and then don't fall into that immigration, jail to immigration, jail to deportation pipeline.
Entonces el punto final es que todo esto está sobre las leyes locales, en que personas como Jamie no pueden ser detenidas por la policía, entonces ellos van a la cárcel y de ahí pueden ser deportados.
And Kelly, I'll pass it back to you. Thank you, Frank. Great job translating this part.
So the next question we have is, there's very similar laws, state laws that have been passed similar to Virginia's, but looking specifically at Virginia's, have we seen convictions since this law went into effect in July of this year?
Entonces viendo, hay muchas leyes que han sido pasadas que son muy similares a la de Virginia, pero la pregunta es que si hemos visto casos de convicciones que han sido similares a los de Virginia.
Yeah, and so we have seen at least one person charged. It made the news. It was a man in Chesterfield in August of this year. He was charged with 10 times more than the allowable limit of plants per household. And so he had about 49 plants, and you're only allowed to have about 4.
Entonces, sí hemos visto un caso en que un hombre ha sido cargado con tener más de 4 plantas. Él tenía 49, que es más del límite que una persona puede tener.
Yeah. And so the plants were also not labeled as required by the statute, and the plants were not in public view as required by statute.
Entonces las plantas no estaban muy bien indicadas y también no estaban en público.
If you could go to the next slide. The next question is, where can people who are viewing this today find out more information about the effects of the law on immigrants? And so we have two resources. There's an excellent advisory here. There's a link to the website on the effects of marijuana laws on immigrants.
Entonces, si hay alguna persona aquí viendo esta presentación y quiere saber más, entonces aquí hay unos enlaces para poder encontrar más información sobre los efectos de la marihuana y los inmigrantes.
And then also the legal effect, and specifically in Virginia, our organization, Care Coalition, actually writes the chart explaining the consequences of all crimes on immigrants. So whether it be, DUIs or petty theft or marijuana convictions, we've got a chart there as well.
Entonces ellos también tienen un gráfico enseñando todas las infracciones que las personas pueden tener y también los inmigrantes, y puede ser como manejando sobre la influencia del alcohol, otras cosas así.
And so I want to leave this group with some advice on what can immigrants do and what should U.S. citizens be thinking about, which is also really important. Because if you're a U.S. citizen and you've got a spouse who's immigrant, or if you smoke with friends who might be in a sensitive immigration status, it's really important to keep these things in mind.
Entonces ella quiere dejar a la audiencia pensando sobre si ustedes tienen amigos que son inmigrantes o si tienen una esposa que también no tiene residencia aquí en los Estados Unidos, que estas cosas son muy importantes.
And so here's the ludicrous or just crazy thing about our law. In this country, to be deported for having marijuana, you don't actually have to have a conviction. ICE can still try to deport somebody without a conviction.
Entonces la cosa es que para alguien en este país, para ser deportado, no tiene que tener la convicción de tener marihuana, porque ICE todavía puede buscar la forma de encontrar alguna falta y deportarlos.
And so if an immigrant admits to an immigration official that they possessed marijuana, that can be considered enough to make them deportable.
Entonces, si alguien confiesa a algún oficial de la ley que ellos han tenido marihuana, entonces eso puede ser suficiente para que ellos puedan ser deportados.
So if you're an immigrant, stay away from marijuana until you become a U.S. citizen. I know I know that marijuana has some very beneficial medical effects. So if you really need marijuana or medical marijuana, you need to consult with an attorney.
Entonces, si usted es un inmigrante, por favor, manténgase lejos de la marihuana. Y si usted en realidad necesita la marihuana, entonces busque un attorney que le pueda ayudar a buscar una solución.
If you're an immigrant, don't carry marijuana around. And if you're a U.S. citizen, be conscious of who you're carrying marijuana around. If you've got it in your car and you get pulled over and you've got a friend who's an immigrant in the car, that could have serious consequences on them.
Si eres un inmigrante, no cargues marihuana contigo. Y si eres un ciudadano de los Estados Unidos, también piensa sobre quién está alrededor tuyo. Si es un inmigrante, que ellos también pueden ser detenidos y también pueden ser deportados.
Be conscious if you got like marijuana stickers or t-shirts or things like that. If you got anything on social media like Facebook, ICE will be looking at your Facebook. They look there all the time, on your Twitter, on your social media. Be very cautious because those things can be used as allegations against you.
Y si también tiene algo en las redes sociales sobre marihuana, ICE también puede ver todo eso. O si tiene una camisa que tenga el logo de marihuana o algo así, ICE puede usar eso en contra de usted.
The law is not fair. It is not just. And so these are just things to think about, especially if you're a U.S. citizen and you want to be sensitive to people around you.
La ley es nada justa. Y entonces, si usted es un ciudadano de los Estados Unidos, por favor, piense sobre las personas que usted está cerca.
If you're an immigrant and you work in the industry, in the marijuana industry, Make sure you get a legal consult before you depart the United States to visit family or friends abroad.
Si usted es un inmigrante y va a salir del país, por favor, asegúrese de que usted consulte con alguien legal que le pueda ayudar a asegurarse de que usted pueda salir en buenos términos.
And finally, never talk about marijuana or any controlled substance with immigration officials, Custom and Border Patrol, anytime you're going in and out of the airport. Don't discuss that unless you've talked with an attorney first, or even have an attorney with you, helping you guide your way through the border.
Y si usted es un inmigrante y nunca hable de la marihuana con un oficial de inmigración, no hable con un oficial de inmigración, al menos de que usted tenga un attorney con usted ahí en el momento.
Finally, I want to thank Frank, our interpreter, for getting us through this presentation, and Becca, my very smart, savvy co-host, and then Tyler, who's on tech for us today.
Y también le quiero dar las gracias a mí por ser el traductor, a Rebecca y también a Tyler que está ayudando en el otro lado.